My final guests are Isaac Michael Ybarra, a progressive climate activist and artist, and Chris Johnson, the managing director of Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends, which aims to mobilize young conservative leaders to renew the GOP's legacy of environmental leadership and lay the groundwork for a free market climate breakthrough. Have a listen. So just to start off with, this is a unique event in that you have progressives and conservatives coming together to talk about the environment. I would love to get both of your takes on how it's been and, what you see for this bipartisan relationship going forward.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a lot. There was some clear vocabulary differences, some ways that we talk about this stuff, different priorities, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it was really great to kind of see folks get pragmatic really quickly once we got past those barriers and realized that the enemy that we perceived is not our actual enemy. And honestly, a lot of it was just like, hey, we're friendly people. We're having a good time. And yeah, it was really encouraging.
Yeah, Isaac.
I think I can reiterate that it was great to meet up with people who are, neighbors and not opponents. And it was easier to have a discussion amongst each other.
Yeah. And do you see that as hopeful for younger millennials and Generation Z going forward? I mean, looking at this, it was sort of emblematic of maybe the future of politics and activism in a way.
Yeah. I would love to be more optimistic.
Yeah.
I think spaces like this are really unique. I think they're very productive. I think there's a lot of good conversations that kind of happen, but our culture broadly is so deeply polarized, and the state of our politics is not going to change anytime soon, just because we have a couple of these moments. Now, if we make a culture of that, great, but that's, I think, going to take a lot of time. So I think what we should do is take our lessons learned from this, go back into our corners with our own, groups of folks that care about this, that are on our team, and figure out the best ways to message to them that's going to lead to, once we all have to come back together to make public policy, that we're all on the same page.
Right.
I'd say my take on that is completely different. I'm excited, and I feel like the square has been rounded where the corners are kind of gone and we've got a circle going. So I think it's easier to navigate between each other.
Right. And I want to get into what you each do individually in your areas of activism. Isaac, you're focused on telling stories of Indigenous people, and particularly in this area. Before the interview, we were talking about your ancestors and growing up in the LA area. Is that what really got you into environmentalism and this realm?
That is a tough question. I would say, you can't jump into something that you're already a part of. And so being surrounded by nature and learning so much about nature from the people you love and hold dear to you, encourages you to go back and preserve those spaces so that you can teach your young ones.
Right.
I tell stories not just of Indigenous people, but the Indigenous land, and creating more space for our cultural stories to remain prevalent and relevant.
Do you think environmentalism and activism for Indigenous communities sort of go hand in hand?
Yeah, of course. I think I read a stat somewhere that almost 80% of environmental advocacy is spearheaded by Indigenous communities around the globe. So.
Right. And Chris, you oftentimes don't hear Republican and conservative and environmentalism. A lot of it's the language that's, involved and such. But I wanted to get your take. How did you get into this realm?
Yeah, as annoying as it is, I really don't love the term environmentalist. I don't use it for myself, even though it's kind of similar for goals, because ultimately when as conservatives we're looking at the climate problem, yes, it's an environmental problem, but it's an energy problem, it's an economic problem, it's a trade problem. So I got started working in Republican politics in Ohio during the fracking boom. And I know in environmental circles, fracking is a dirty word, but I ultimately got to see a way in which we saw emissions go down in Ohio due to market-driven conservative policies, and it created this set of permission structures for conservatives to talk about, reducing emissions, this is good, this is how we do things, this is a conservative conservation effort, bringing back the rhetoric of Reagan and Nixon and so many Republicans, Governor Schwarzenegger, before them, creating the kind of muscle memory that allowed them now in 2024 to start advocating for some really robust climate policies, boosting nuclear, advocating for permitting reform, holding China accountable for their pollution on the global stage. All of those things got started because of stuff like people like me seeing fracking a technology reduce emissions and make me go, yeah, we should be bragging about this. As Americans, we should get excited about this. As conservatives, we should get excited about this.
And you hear Ulysses S. Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, Reagan, Nixon,
Yes.
Schwarzenegger, all of these Republican figures. What are some Republican figures today in 2024, in your view, that are sort of leading the charge on this issue?
Yeah, I think the answer you're usually going to get is the more moderate folks, and so I'm sure they're going to get plenty of praise, and deservedly so. You know, if you're somebody like a Mitt Romney or whatever, who's taken on this issue seriously. But there's a lot of folks on the more MAGA, America First right, who are taking on this issue as well. They're just talking about it in a totally different way. And so you see folks like Governor DeSantis talking about resilience and taking on emissions abroad, reducing emissions at home, doing the kind of building that we're going to need for a 21st century economy in a changing climate. All those kind of things are often not talked about as climate things because he doesn't talk about them as climate things. But for those of us that are on the eco right, we kind of get the joke, and we kind of see what he's doing, and we're thankful that there's leaders like him, especially younger leaders like him, who are setting the tone for the next generation conservatives.
So one common theme I've observed today is language, and it seems like maybe there's a language barrier between those, maybe on the left-leaning side of this issue and those on the right. And some talking to conservatives, it seems like maybe it's a generational barrier as well. Talk about that barrier of language. I mean, Governor Schwarzenegger talked about how he doesn't like when it's described as climate or climate change. Do you see that in your day-to-day work in this field? Isaac, we'll go first.
I'd say, of course. I think the biggest thing that I took away from today is, there's pollution on Tongva land, and pollution is no good. So let's start there, and let's hold each other accountable, and take a stand against that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we've seen when we're talking to right of center audiences is exactly what Governor Schwarzenegger was talking about. If you go in there and you talk about carbon and climate and all these kind of things, like, we on the eco right acknowledge those are serious problems we need to address, but framing it for our audiences on the right as pollution, as a global problem, focusing on China since they're 3 times as dirty as our production is, all those kind of things, again, to create the right set of permission structures to support policies that do reduce emissions, that do address the climate issue, even if we're not making it a climate thing. And so I was so encouraged to hear Governor Schwarzenegger seeing those kinds of responses. We've seen polling that shows if you ask about, hey, should we address carbon pollution from China, you'd get 60-70% support. If you but if you drop the carbon or you don't make it a climate thing, you're getting 85-90% support among Trump supporting Republicans. And obviously reducing emissions in China is a step towards reducing emissions globally in the way that we need to.
Right. And we see a lot of activism in the, environmental space, conservation space. You see a lot of, protests. And one, I was chatting with Christy and Chris about this earlier. You often see the images of the throwing red paint on, in museums in Europe and such. And it, they're climate change or environmental protesters. They're bringing attention in that way. But at the same time, there seems to be this common thread of, okay, but we're not getting results. What do you both think is the biggest barrier right now facing people who want to make a difference in this space?
I'll let you go ahead.
I think politics is such a dirty word. We heard from Isabel earlier talking about how 50-some% of Gen Z identifies as an independent. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of folks who are really not interested in the political process, think it's messy, think it's selling out, think it's embracing neoliberalism or neoconservatism, whatever boogeyman your side decides is the problem. And the reality is that doesn't stop the desire to do something. That doesn't stop the desire for activism. And so it ends up in these moments of lash out where you're throwing paint or you're blocking traffic or whatever, where if that were funneled towards actually getting involved in the political process, working in primary elections to get folks elected who are good on this issue, and ultimately maybe working for a member of Congress on the Hill, drafting legislation that does that stuff. I know that's a harder lift for a lot of folks, but it's so much more effective. And if we get away from politics as a dirty word and we understand that politics is necessary to getting things done, you'll see that shift, that pressure valve go towards something a lot more productive.
Right.
I'd say the biggest barrier facing activists face is propaganda, because throwing paint on a glass protective case against a painting or stopping traffic is another form of freedom of speech. And it forces people who aren't paying attention to pay attention and question motives.
Right, right. And do you feel that the news media and maybe the media at large, opinion media as well, what role do you think that's playing in this? Because it seems like, and I'm kind of getting the sense from your answer, it's painted maybe a picture that isn't necessarily the way you see it. Do you think the news media is tainted?
Of course.
Yeah. Tainted this issue?
I work with cameras. I'm a filmmaker, and we paint the picture. But that's the great thing about freedom of speech is, and this opportunity here, we have we have a group of people who are on the opposite side of the aisle, just communicating and speaking to each other, like I said, as neighbors. So the media is tainted, but I wouldn't say it's the enemy either.
Right. And do you feel that the media is tainting this issue?
Yeah, I feel like this is a tough one when talking to the media.
No, seriously.
Seriously. I do think, there's an entertainment value add to creating a world in which there's two enemies of each other that are fighting against one another for issues that are of real importance, and so it raises the temperature in the room so much. And so when you're able to have an issue of such salience like climate, and then you're able to paint it as you're either with these guys who are crazy and think that climate change is fake and it's all made up by communists to ruin America, or you have the folks that are the world is ending tomorrow. Both of those create a sense of not just enmity between people, but also a sense of like, well, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be done? It creates what folks our age refer to as like doomerism, where you're like, well, nothing matters anyways. It's a nihilistic view of the world. That's the kind of stuff that media environment creates, unfortunately. And look, I'm on cable news regularly. I'm part of the problem. I'm trying to make the discourse better, but it's a real issue that there's ultimately a market for that kind of media.
Yeah, so I feel like we just went to maybe a darker place there.
Sorry.
So I want to end on a more positive note. What is one area where you think both sides of the political spectrum can come together on the environment? Isaac, you first.
The biggest thing that I hope everyone takes away is get to know your local tribes, because those are your allies and they have a lot of knowledge with solutions that we're looking for.
Right.
I think there's a sense that as we get further down the line here and the climate problem is not solved, and our environment continues to be degraded by various forms of pollution, there is a sense that everybody is coming to the realization that there are trade-offs in public policy making, and people are becoming more and more comfortable with talking about those trade-offs and talking about them with their own team and acknowledging, hey, there's this thing that we're going to do. It's not perfect. We're going to have to make some deals. We're going to have to concede a little bit to the other side, but it's necessary, and the longer we wait on doing this, the worse it's going to get. And so I think I was really encouraged, even in moments of tension in the conversation today, that we ultimately got to the point where we're all going to have to sacrifice something here, and that's okay, because we're going to move closer to solving the problem.
Tell us about how you're using film and artwork to tell this story and to pursue activism.
We have the ability to influence each other through creative practices, and sometimes that influence can be called propaganda. So we need anti-propaganda, and I believe encouraging all of us to reflect and remember that it's not just about us and the humans. We're also connected to habitat and nature. We're not separated from that. So through a lot of my films, I do my best to show nature's perspective.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much to you both. Yeah, we appreciate it. And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, the full event is available on our website, thehill.com. I'm Julia Manchester. I hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.